So here's the deal, I'm taking over your inheritance. If you've got a problem with that, we can just get divorced and you can disappear. Your father always said it right, you can't do anything, that's why he's got you doing odd jobs at the subsidiary. Tough luck for you. Steve said this and mentioned about divorce. All right. Thinking I would be against the divorce, Steve looked somewhat taken aback when I agreed readily. No more business dealings. With that, I left the company. A male colleague chased after me with a pale face. However, I didn't look back and got into my car. Steve, you married me just for my dad's money, you truly are a greedy soul. I was foolish not to see through you, but you, who would disgrace our family and wait for a person to pass just for money, are even more foolish. I feel a bit sorry for you, but for someone who has lost their human heart, there is no room for sympathy. I will definitely send you to hell. I will never forgive you. My name is Jennifer Atwood, and I just celebrated my 42nd birthday last week. I met my husband Steve in the last year of my 30s and got married. I loved my job and always thought I'd be fine on my own, but fate led me to marry him. The one who introduced him to me was none other than my dad. My dad loved drinking, and after work, he would go out every night to drink. Drinking stylishly seemed to be his creed, and he would always head out dressed in chic outfits. He was particular about paying in cash rather than using cards. No matter how much he drank, he was never overwhelmed by alcohol, and he could drink until morning without it affecting him. Getting drunk is okay, but then you miss out on the true taste of the liquor. He would say and start talking about what makes alcohol taste good. For me, who can't drink, his stories sound like an alien language. Yet, he would always tell me, you should find yourself a husband who can drink. And the husband he caught for me was Steve. Steve used to come as a customer to the bar where my dad frequently went. He was a corporate employee in his late 30s like me, working in sales. By chance, they sat close to each other and hit it off as they talked. My dad treated Steve to some drinks, and after meeting a few times at the bar, they started talking about me. I once asked Steve what my dad had told him about me. He said he had a daughter who used to model. She even aimed to be an actress, so she missed her chance to marry. But she's good at cooking and sewing. She's charming like him, so he wants me to meet her. I actually thought I got fooled by him. I was told and so embarrassed, could feel my face burning. The modeling he referred to must have been when I modeled for a supermarket flyer as a child. And just because I was in the drama club during my student years, he made it sound like I had been aiming to become an actress. As for cooking and sewing, I'm just average, but being from a single-father home, I had to do it out of necessity. I didn't lie, I just exaggerated a bit. My father would say with a nonchalant expression whenever I complained. That's just how he always is. Easygoing and good-natured. Despite being an older man, he had many friends. Eventually, due to the unusually good relationship between my father and Steve, we ended up getting married. Steve was kind to both my dad and me. He was rich in conversation and knew how to win people over. My dad would say, he's just like I was when I was young, a cliché but true statement. As painful as it is to admit, that may have been why I developed a liking for Steve. Steve seemed happy to have become my dad's son-in-law. The fact that my dad was the president of a company was probably one of the attractions. But more than that, they strangely hit it off. As for me, I was like an extra to my dad. Still, I thought marrying Steve, who was kind and inclusive, was the greatest happiness for me. Looking back now, I should have been more cautious about choosing a spouse. Who could have imagined that this marriage, brought about by my dad, would turn into such hellish suffering? I never expected that my dad, who always had a way of stirring things up, would influence my marriage as well. It was about a year after Steve and I got married that my dad fell ill and was hospitalized. He always loved his drink, and it seemed his liver, which he had taxed since his youth, was now screaming for mercy. Dr. Connor, who is my dad's primary care doctor, and I had advised him to stop drinking alcohol. As a result, he was sulking on his hospital bed. Alcohol is the medicine of life. What do I have to live for now? He would complain daily. However, once he was allowed to walk around the hospital, he quickly made many friends there with his usual affability, which was surprising. He seemed to enjoy chatting in the playroom for a few minutes each day. I was relieved to see that my dad had found some joy. "How's your father doing?" Whenever I returned from visiting my dad, Steve would always ask this. Thinking Steve was also worried about him, I made it a point to describe my dad's condition in detail. When I visited the hospital last week, he was connected to tubes and needed to rest. But this week, since he's been doing better, I told Steve that he could now walk around the hospital. I thought Steve would be relieved, but his reaction was unexpected. Huh, he can walk now? That's too bad. I doubted my ears. What did he mean by that? His comment could be taken as if he wasn't happy about my dad's recovery, so I asked, too bad? Then he said, oh. I meant that I wanted to take care of your dad when he couldn't move. I wanted to be there for him, that's all. It's great that he can walk now, really. Oh, but hey. Steve quickly changed the subject to talk about his work. He seemed a bit flustered but continued. Our company just landed a major contract thanks to my efforts. It was a tough one to secure. Something about the other party having high hopes for my future, so they went ahead with the contract. And it's across multiple lines too. So my performance is really soaring. It was unusual for him to talk about his work with such confidence. He usually seemed more humble about his work. It must have been a contract he really wanted. Well, it's a complicated story for you who doesn't do much important work. Sorry, no offense intended, don't worry about it. Steve said and went back to his room. I felt a slight discomfort with his words but decided not to dwell on it since he said he meant nothing by it. In the first year of our marriage, he had always been kind. He was capable at work, and people often said he was the ideal husband. He never frowned even if I came home later than him. Before my dad was hospitalized, he would often visit my dad's house to keep him company. Now, he even helps clean the living room and bathroom at home. Steve said, I like cleaning. It's nicer for you when you come home to clean rooms and bathroom, right? In return, he asked me always to let him know when I would be finishing work. He needed to know so he could start cleaning at the right time. Typical of the conscientious Steve, I had to laugh a little. Such a kind Steve couldn't possibly find my father's recovery unfortunate. It must have been, as Steve said, that he wanted to be supportive. I convinced myself and started preparing for work the next day. A few days later, I received a call from the hospital. My father's condition had worsened. I left work and headed to the hospital where he was staying. In the hospital room, he was connected to several tubes, his eyes closed. I tried to take the fact that he was connected to tubes as a good sign and composed myself. Dr. Connor explained the situation, and I realized that I needed to be prepared for the near future. Should I contact my mother? When I was in high school, my parents got divorced. I heard that the reason for their divorce was that she could no longer keep up with his overly free-spirited nature. However, because he couldn't do anything on his own, I was taken in by him. Already being in high school, I decided on my own to stay with him, and I am grateful to him for funding my college education. That's why I was working hard at my job now, to repay him for his kindness. But he doesn't have much time left. I'm sure that if I were my mother, I would want to be contacted. I decided that I would send a message to her when I got home. First, I returned to the office to finish the work I had left undone, and then I went home. Although I hadn't come to terms with my feelings yet, thought that talking to my mother and Steve might help me settle down. Steve was in the living room. Perhaps because I had told him I would be coming home early, the room hadn't been cleaned. Since he usually does the cleaning, I thought I would do it today, but as I was thinking this, spoke to Steve who was using his phone on the sofa. Today, I was called out from work by the hospital. It's about Dad. Before I could finish, he threw his phone on the sofa, turned to me with energy, and said with a smile, "Did your father finally pass away?" I was so overwhelmed by his forcefulness that I couldn't reply immediately. Then, for some reason, he continued talking on his own. Right. He wasn't well before he was hospitalized. It must be tough for you, Jennifer, but don't worry, I'm here. Things like managing the company and finances are too difficult for you who lacks education and culture, right? So, although his speech was still midway, I interrupted him realizing the huge misunderstanding. Steve. It's okay, everything's okay. Dad's still alive. Thank you for all your concern, I said. Upon hearing this, he stopped moving and displayed a noticeably disappointed expression. I couldn't understand why he would make such a face. He seemed to care about my dad's company and finances, but in the event of an emergency, I planned to consult the appropriate professionals. My dad has always strongly advised me not to discuss the management details with anyone close, even if they are family. Since Steve is just a salesperson at a company, my dad and I have not shared the specifics of our company with him. Perhaps sensing the situation, Steve had never asked us about it. Seeing Steve still looking disappointed, informed him about my dad's condition. So, it's a situation where we need to be prepared. Could you visit Dad soon, Steve? Then he looked up slightly, smiled gently at me, and stood up from the sofa. Understood. I'll go if I can, he said and went back to his room. His words echoed in my mind. In the adult world, I'll go if I can often equals I won't go. I silently watched as Steve walked away. My dad passed away 2 weeks later. The decline from his illness to his death felt incredibly fast. By the time his liver started screaming, it was already too late. During those 2 weeks, I stayed at the hospital overnight to keep an eye on his condition. Although he was connected to tubes until the end, it seemed he passed away without much suffering. During the last 2 weeks, many people who had been close to him came to visit his hospital room. Drinking buddies, old friends, and daily visits from people from my dad's and my company's. Even patients who had become his friends in the hospital came to his room to talk to my dad, who remained asleep. It was a 2-week period during which I truly felt that my dad was loved by many. However, despite the many visitors, Steve never once came to visit my dad. Though I had some expectation from his tone, I was utterly dismayed that he, having been so cherished by my dad, showed such callous disregard. I thought of asking Steve to help with the funeral arrangements, but I couldn't get in touch with him. When I contacted his company, they said he had taken bereavement leave. Yet he did not return home, and, ultimately, he did not show up at the funeral either. Although people from Steve's company came to offer their condolences, they were understandably puzzled by his absence. I was so busy after my dad passed away that I didn't even have time to cry. I felt guilty but had to ask my mom to help sort through the tedious paperwork. It was 10 days after my dad's death before I could finally settle down at home. During that time, couldn't get in touch with Steve at all. I was so worried he might have been in an accident. However, when I got home and saw him in the living room, I felt a bit relieved. Steve, what happened? You didn't come to the hospital, you weren't at home, and I couldn't reach you. Dad passed away, you know. Steve, who was still fiddling with his phone on the sofa, said without looking at me. Yeah, I know. It took longer than I thought since he collapsed. I was getting irritated, wondering how long he would make me wait. I couldn't understand his words. He must have known about my dad's death since he had applied for bereavement leave at work. So why hadn't he shown up at the hospital or the funeral? Despite any circumstances, I felt intense anger at his current comments. We've been married for a year. No, even before that, my dad treated you well, right? Why would you repay his kindness with such betrayal? At that moment, I felt tears about to come for the first time since his death. But I refused to let myself cry over such a thing, and I forced back the tears. What? Kindness? What are you talking about? It's the other way around. I married someone like you who can't do anything. If anything, I should be the one thanked by your father. You say I should come to the funeral, but if you needed me, you should have come to me. He burst into carefree laughter while still looking at his phone screen. Was this the kind Steve I knew? Was my belief that he adored my dad just an illusion? When I met him at the bar, another customer said, "That man is the president," so I approached him and buttered him up a bit. Then he started treating me nicely, and I thought, this guy is useful. My dad was pleased to have found Steve. He was genuinely happy, as if he had gained a son. Man, this past year has been torture. I had to be nice to you and suck up to your father, right? I couldn't have kept my motivation if I wasn't expecting some inheritance to come my way eventually. But I didn't expect him to fall ill so soon, guess that was a stroke of luck. The kind Steve was indeed an illusion. I was so shocked that I couldn't move or speak. The tears I had been holding back flowed ceaselessly. So, I'll be managing your inheritance. If you have a problem with that, get divorced and disappear. But you can't actually divorce, can you? You can't do anything, right? Even your job is just menial, isn't it? Your father used to say so. You're only good for odd jobs at the subsidiary. Tough luck, huh? He laughed loudly. My tears had completely stopped, replaced now only by anger. Who was this person in front of me? Surely, he must be some kind of demon that feeds on the kindness of others. Without saying anything, I went back to my own bedroom. Even after I closed the door, I could still hear his annoying laughter. With my hands pressed against my ears, I firmly resolved in my angered heart. Steve, I will never forgive you. Dad once said Steve was just like my dad when he was young, but Steve is nothing like Dad. Although my dad might have exaggerated at times, he never lied. Steve, you married me solely for my dad's wealth. You really are a money-grubbing fiend. I was foolish not to see through you, but you, who disgraced our family and waited for someone to die for money, are even more foolish. I feel slightly sorry for you, but there is no room for sympathy for someone who has lost their humanity. I will definitely send you in hell. I will never forgive you. After that, I moved in with my mom because I couldn't stand to face Steve. Today is my day off, so my mom and I ordered lunch and ate together. We're having coffee after the meal. Even though I worry about troubling her, I'm telling her everything that happened. It's so embarrassing that even after living with him for a year, I didn't realize Steve's true nature, not to mention when we first met. Dad was deceived by him until the very end. It's so sad. Upon hearing my words, she sipped her coffee and murmured thoughtfully. I don't think he would pass away without leaving something behind, you know? I didn't fully understand what she was suggesting, but after all, they had been married for nearly 20 years. I decided to listen carefully to her words. Even so, Dad actually told Steve that I was just doing menial work at the company. Isn't that awful? He took it to heart and scorned me for it. Indeed, the work I do might seem menial to some. However, I take pride and dedication in my work. The thought of Steve's contemptuous face flashed through my mind. That was your father's way of protecting you, dear. You know the deal, right? Even among close relations. He promised not to divulge the details of the work. Indeed, as she said, now that seemed oddly convenient. After all, Steve doesn't really know what my actual work entails. And, you know, I might have told you that we divorced because I couldn't keep up with his overly free spirit. But there was actually another reason. Perhaps because I looked eager to know more, she discreetly shared the real reason with me. It was surprising yet fitting of my dad. Once again, I was reminded of the unconventional life he had led. And her story didn't end there. That's why, I believe he definitely left a will. By the way, I received a call from his lawyer, Matthew. He wanted to gather all the relevant parties together. Mom, you really know everything about Dad. I admire that. I said, and she laughed cheerfully. What are you talking about? I'm just his long-divorced wife who knows nothing. I had spent more time with Dad than Mom had. Yet, she seemed to understand him better than I did. I was profoundly impressed by the depth of their relationship as a married couple. My brief, superficial marital relationship with Steve paled in comparison. With a wry smile, she gave me one more piece of advice. Jennifer, remember your father's actions well. He loves surprises, so he must have left something else behind. Encouraged by her words, I started to recall his behavior. He truly was carefree, loved his liquor, and enjoyed surprising people. When I graduated high school, he had secretly filmed me crying. He showed that video on my birthday in front of friends who had come over, much to my embarrassment. It was a terrible crying face. Now, it's a fond memory. Dad was always on the lookout to capture good footage on the sly. I had learned how to dodge his camera, but how long had he continued his covert filming? Suddenly, an idea struck me, and I decided to return home. I also needed to discuss the matter of the will with Steve. Mom, I'm going back home for a bit. Thanks. After thanking her, I rushed towards my house. Upon arriving, I found Steve in the living room. Seeing my face, he stood up in a fluster. Whoa. Why are you back all of a sudden? Don't come back. What a way to be greeted. Despite our faltering marriage, this was still my home. There's no reason for me to be unwelcome in my own house. What do you mean? I came because I have something to discuss today. As I moved to sit on the sofa, Steve seemed to hide something there and warned me, "Don't come over here." Preferring to keep my distance from him, I decided to speak from afar. What's this talk about? Just so you know, we're not getting divorced yet. Any inheritance that comes your way, I'll be managing it. I sighed, yet I began to discuss the matter regarding the inheritance that Steve was eagerly anticipating. I got a call from Matthew, the lawyer, asking for all relevant parties to gather. There might be a will. So, Steve, you should attend too. Listening to my words, his eyes lit up. Ah, that's great. The scent of money is getting stronger. Okay, I'll definitely participate and make sure to keep an eye on where the money goes. As expected, he was in high mood. In the meantime, I wandered around looking for something particular. It was modestly placed next to a potted plant by the window. After retrieving the item I was looking for, I decided to return to my mother's house, as I had no more business at my own home. Women's shoes were lined up at the entrance, just as when I had entered. The kind I would never wear, heels and pumps. Steve is always sloppy. I muttered to myself as I left the house. At the court, where Matthew had called us to gather, there were 5 of us. My uncle Samuel and his wife, my mother, myself, and Steve. Samuel had no children. I half expected some dramatic revelation like a secret child of my dad's to appear, but such twists are rare in real life. Today's meeting was indeed about his will. Dad had entrusted his will to his personal lawyer, Matthew. The contents of the will, once opened, were as follows. My dad's successor in the company would be Samuel, his cherished collections at home were left to me, his daughter. And the rest of the estate was to be inherited by Steve, who was currently my husband. The details were more complex, but that was the gist of my understanding. Steve, indiscreetly, gave a fist pump right in the courtroom. Haha. How about that, Jennifer? Looks like your dad really liked me. This is more than I expected. All that bootlicking paid off. Samuel, his wife, and my mother all looked appalled by his disgraceful behavior. I felt deeply embarrassed that this man was technically still my husband. At that moment, I felt a strong desire to get a divorce as soon as possible. Steve rapidly signed the prepared documents. I wondered if he really understood what he was signing. I'm not going to read all this fine print. As long as I get the inheritance, that's all that matters. The old man gets company, huh? You get the junk, and I get the assets. I can't stop laughing. Everyone else in the room asked Steve if he was truly okay with the inheritance as it was laid out. Matthew tried to explain the details of the inheritance, but Steve wouldn't listen properly. Eventually, he said, yeah, I get it. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything. By the way, I'm taking the $1,000 that was left in your dad's wallet. After signing the documents, Steve happily went off somewhere. Such a foolish man. Ignoring advice never leads to anything good. I visited my home the next day to confirm with him for the last time. Because I visited my home after the discussion of the will, Steve mistakenly thought I was after the inheritance he was to receive. He has already changed the door key. At first, he wouldn't let me in. I had to explain several times that wasn't the case before I could enter. Isn't it normal to think a daughter inheriting junk would come after my money? That kind of a normal only exists in fiction. What I inherited was not junk, but his prized collection. He had cherished it during his lifetime, and I intended to honor his legacy. What are you doing here then? If you're not after the money, I'd like you to leave. I have people coming over. His demeanor was more intimidating than I could have ever imagined from him before. I was impressed he had managed to hide this side of himself for so long. I'll leave soon. I just wanted to check something. I wanted to confirm that he truly understood what he was inheriting. And also, about our future. Of course I'm going to inherit, I'm not changing my mind about that. Stop talking about it. Oh, and since I'm getting money, I don't need you anymore. So, let's get divorced. With that, Steve mentioned about divorce. All right. He seemed to think I would be reluctant to divorce, so when I readily agreed, his face fell flat in surprise. Yet, it seemed he couldn't resist throwing one more barb my way. Just try to scrape by doing menial work or whatever else on your own. It's pathetic, really, how your own father left you nothing. As Steve laughed mockingly, I decided to question him. Steve, you mentioned before that you closed a big deal, saying that they had high expectations for your future. Are you keeping up with the clients properly? I hope you're not just finishing contracts and forgetting about them. Surprised by such a question from me, Steve looked at me with a hint of incredulity. But he quickly twisted his mouth into a sneer and said disdainfully, "Oh, what an unusual question from someone who can't do anything. Has your father's death suddenly sparked an interest in business?" I was used to his disdain by now. However, his next answer would determine my next move. You know nothing, so I'll tell you, winning contracts is all about grabbing them first. Coordination with clients? Why should I bother with that? It's just annoying. What if I communicate too much and the deal falls through? Just as I thought, Steve wasn't conducting business properly. He always talked as if he was actively working at the forefront. Probably, he only acted the part during contract negotiations. Steve had deceived us for a year, this was just another day's work for him. I see. And do you know the name of the company president? Steve seemed irritated by another question. What's with you all of a sudden? The president's name? I don't know it. Knowing it won't win contracts. True, perhaps, but what company would want to deal with a salesman who doesn't even know the president's name? I gave Steve name card of my lawyer. From now, we can proceed with divorce through our lawyer. Bye, then. Steve looked puzzled. Don't ever come back. Well, eventually, it's Steve who will have to leave this house, but until that day, I'll leave him be. Just then, as I was leaving, a young woman entered the house. She looked at me quizzically. I sent her a serene smile, conveying that she shouldn't worry, we would be strangers in just a few minutes. I got into the car waiting on the street. First, to my lawyer please, I said to my driver, signaling there was still work to be done. After witnessing his behavior earlier, I had made up my mind. Steve, if you underestimate the world, or your job, you're going to learn a painful lesson. After I talked to my lawyer, I headed to the business district and had the car stop in front of a building. This was where Steve worked. I had visited several times, always appreciating the modern vibe of the entrance. When a male employee spotted me walking through the entrance, he hurried over, surprised. Ms. Atwood. I was actually planning to visit your company soon. What brings you here today? Are you alone? He was involved in that notable contract. Saving myself the hassle, I simply told him. No more business dealings. With that, I left the company. He followed me out, his face pale with shock. I didn't look back as I got into the car. I would send the details later, but any complaints or grievances should be directed to Steve. I hurried to my mother's house to prepare for the next steps. The barrage of furious calls from Steve started on the Monday after the weekend. Mondays are often filled with meetings, so I couldn't answer the phone. Actually, I have no intention of answering, whether I'm in meetings or not. Come over if you need something, Steve once said, didn't he? I waited for Steve in the president's office for our final confrontation. He's likely been instructed by his boss to come here, unaware that I would be present. Since it was a significant moment, invited my mother, who had supported me through everything, to have a ringside seat. Soon, there was a knock on the door. Ms. Atwood, I've brought Steve. Announced by my secretary, Catherine, as Steve walked in. Ah, excuse me. He muttered, his voice lacking any business-like vigor. And clearly reluctant. The issue of no more business dealings must have gotten him a serious scolding from his boss. He likely thought he was being summoned to apologize. Steve, long time no see. You look down. Are you eating well? My greeting probably caught him off guard, his eyes widening in shock. Jennifer? Why are you here? Because this is my office, my workplace. You weren't told in detail due to a promise with my dad. I'm the president of this company. Surprised? He shook his head vigorously, as if refusing to believe the reality in front of him. But the president was supposed to be your father. You were just doing menial work at a subsidiary. What's going on? Seeing his confusion, explained. My dad ran the older, family-inherited company. Recently, we founded this new company together. Dad was too busy with the old company, so he left this one to me. With our brainstorms, we built this company together, and it turned out to be a huge success. Now, this company employs over 9,000 people, all of whom are like family to me. You had a chance to know I was the president. Your company signed a contract with us, and you were in charge, weren't you? It's unheard of for someone in charge not to know the president's name, and not to communicate after signing the contract? That's just unacceptable. Please, have a long talk with the rest of the company about this. This wasn't just a comment as his ex-wife, but as a professional thoroughly disillusioned by Steve's attitude. Steve gritted his teeth in frustration, looking down. Then, looking up, he scoffed, big company or not, I'm disappointed the president is such a useless old lady. I refuse to contract with you. As if Steve had the authority to decide that on his own. Truly, he underestimated his job. As he tried to leave, my assistant stationed at the door pushed him back into the room. Steve, we're not done talking. It seems you've been unfaithful throughout our marriage, haven't you? My words made him flinch, but he quickly tried to regain his composure. That woman you saw me with the other day? I met her after we separated. Our marital relationship was already broken, so you have no complaints. Right? Since Steve seemed to not listen. During our marriage, you had an affair, didn't you? I said it slowly this time. He didn't seem to like the way I said it and shouted back, his face turning red. I did not. You can't just make baseless accusations. It's curious how guilty people always demand proof. So, I decided to provide some. In the collection I inherited from my dad was his diary. I took the liberty of reading it. He meticulously documented this past year. Steve supposedly went out for drinks, but ended up at a hotel with a young woman. He thought he'd shaken me off, but never underestimate me. I wonder if I should tell Jennifer. There are things only a married couple can understand. Let's wait and see. I planned to visit Jennifer's house, but saw Steve walking with an unknown woman. Jennifer's working overtime again. Hang in there, Jennifer. As I read excerpts from my dad's diary, Steve clicked his tongue audibly. That's just your father's perspective. It's hardly conclusive proof, is it? Steve remained defiant, refusing to acknowledge the gravity of his actions. If you're really eager for evidence, I'll lay it all out for you. I arranged several photographs on the desk. These showed Steve entering a hotel with a woman. Photography was also one of my dad's hobbies, he always carried a camera with him. These were captured by a camera found among the collection. True to film, they are beautifully clear. And don't worry, it's film. So no tampering possible. Steve snatched the photos from my hand and tore them up on the spot. Seeing no sign of remorse in Steve, I said. Steve, don't you feel anything? Dad knew about your infidelity and kept quiet about it. He believed in you, didn't he? Really? You feel nothing at all? Despite my urgent questioning, all Steve could say was a shut up. I continued, despite feeling pathetic about his response. It seems like Dad eventually gave up on you when you didn't stop your cheating. There was a small camera at home. Dad used to use it for surprises. It was meant to be a prank initially, but it ended up recording unbelievable footage. Dad saw everything. It's likely that Dad had placed several cameras. One of these was not retrieved by him and remained. I collected that one. Steve, it's truly unbelievable. You brought your affair partner into our home, didn't you? It's all recorded by this camera. That's why you insisted inform you when I would be home and why you cleaned the living room and bathroom where you used it for your infidelity. Thanks to Dad, it all makes sense now. Steve scratched his head irritably and slumped into the chair, sulking. I exchanged a nod with my mother. Steve really is unbelievably naive. And why doesn't he listen to anyone? As I had said earlier, Dad had finally written Steve off. I keep saying that your dad wanted to leave the inheritance to me because he thought highly of me. What about the junk you inherited? Was it just meant to expose my infidelity? Ironically, his narcissism is almost enviable here. Yes, according to Steve, Dad wanted to leave him the inheritance. Negative inheritance, that is. Steve, do you remember Dad talking about a joint loan? You only half listened and signed off on it, so you probably forgot. As Steve looked puzzled, my mother started to speak. The reason we divorced was because of his debts. They just kept growing, and he was robbing Peter to pay Paul right up until he died. Never quitting gambling. I think it's a substantial amount. Even then, he didn't seem to understand. I had no choice but to make it clear. Steve, you inherited all the property Dad personally owned. That's not just the assets, but also the debts, including the joint loan. You've already dipped into his money, so you can't disclaim the inheritance now. You have to bear it all. Finally, his complexion changed. It paled rapidly. What? No way. Why should I inherit the old man's debts? That's not valid. I'll renounce it. My dad must have anticipated this reaction. If Steve had really understood and listened to those around him, he would renounce the inheritance immediately. But his greed and failure to verify details led him into this trap. Try renouncing the inheritance if you must. It might give you some peace of mind, though I doubt it'll work. Apparently terrified by the debt, Steve collapsed to his knees, trembling. As sweat streamed down his forehead. Wait, you, Jennifer, you're a president, right? Of this huge company, then you should pay off your old man's debts, right? Why me, why? Steve began to cry loudly. His cries almost like screams. Dad must have regretted introducing such a man to me, knowing his true nature. Steve was the man my dad had introduced to me. Yet, there were times when I thought being married to him was happiness. So, I don't hate my dad for it. The one to blame is Steve, who deceived both my dad and me and turned into a greedy monster. As his health deteriorated, he must have contemplated on his own ways to take revenge on Steve through me. Steve continued to cry. Just then, the phone in the president's office rang. It was connected to reception, and the caller was Steve's boss. I hung up after responding. Steve, you better hurry back to your company. It seems the higher-ups want to talk to you about this issue. Steve, his face paler than ever, seemed to have stopped crying instantly. There you go, I have work to do, so off you go. Goodbye, Steve. I called out to my assistant waiting outside and sent a disoriented Steve back to his office. Hopefully, he makes it back to his company without issue. After the battle, I sat down with my mother in the lounge, soothing myself with some warm coffee. My office is on the 5th floor of a 15-story building. Wanting my employees to enjoy a scenic view while working, the higher floors are dedicated to offices. The top floor has been turned into a cafeteria and break room where employees can relax and enjoy the view, something I take pride in. I enjoy spending time alone in my office, because it allows me to think about the many employees working in this company. Once a week, go through a company newsletter featuring photos of all employees, making an effort to remember each person's face and name. I truly cherish these moments. I received a profound apology from Steve's parents. They were genuinely nice people. It's a pity we couldn't become a real family. The debt Steve was so afraid of turned out not to be as substantial as feared, once offset against the cash Dad had on hand. Dad, who had a preference for paying in cash, apparently kept savings stashed around the house. Steve ended up shouldering a significant debt. Ultimately, the inheritance left to him was negative, but manageable if Steve worked hard enough. As for the complete halt in transactions I ordered with his company, it prompted a thorough investigation. As a result, his negligence was exposed, and he was demoted. Yet, perhaps out of spite, he continues to work at that company. It might also be his way of trying to prove something to me and my dad. Occasionally, I receive messages from Steve. Lengthy texts boasting about how hard he's struggling against adversity. I never reply, of course. As a professional, striving to meet the bare minimum is expected. The house he lives in, still registered in my name, is scheduled for cancellation at the end of the month. He will have to find a new place from scratch. But that's no concern of mine. After all, we are strangers now. I closed the company newsletter and looked out the large window. There's a hint of spring in the air. Seemingly the newsletter will feature new faces. Just the thought is exciting. With that anticipation, continue to dedicate myself to my work today. Today marks exactly 1 year since my dad passed away. Many visitors gathered at the house where my dad lived. His drinking buddies, old friends, and many from my dad's and my company came to visit. Even the friends he made during his hospital stay, who had since been discharged, came to show their healthy and spirited selves. Truly, he was loved by everyone. Somehow, it even seems like the dad in the photos is smiling. Just a little bit, right? I lightly clinked my glass against the one filled with white wine I had placed in front of my dad's photo. The clear, bell-like sound seemed like my dad's laughter.